I'd like to share an incredible story about someone who got married again a second time. We spoke recently about what it means to look at an individual and determine if I'm dating someone or their image. Here's a story of how someone got lost with someone's image and as a result had a tremendous problem getting along with them until things got settled. The woman writes, "My mother-in-law, who I adored, passed away 7 years ago. She was only 62 years old, far too young to leave this world. Her final words to me, her daughter-in-law, was, 'Take care of Tati,' which is her husband. I nodded, saying, 'Of course I will. I would do my best to take care of Tati.' We were all that he had. My father-in-law is a respected rabbi with a deep understanding of human nature. Many people come to him for help with all sorts of problems. My mother-in-law was a preschool teacher for many years, but she took the greatest pride in being a devoted mother and a husband to her husband, and rather a great wife to her husband, a mother to her children, and a great grandmother to her grandchildren. My in-laws had struggled with infertility for many years until a full decade after their marriage, when my husband David was born, their first child after 10 years, followed by younger brother Shimon 2 years later. The two boys were doted upon, but never spoiled. We lived a couple of blocks away, while Shimon lived in Montreal, near his wife's family. So I lived a couple of blocks away from my father-in-law and my mother-in-law. Although my mother-in-law had only 2 children, she did not insist that we had to live nearby. She never imposed any of her wishes on us. She was never demanding of us either. She was an extremely good-hearted woman who existed only to help others, care for others, and never needed anything for herself. She never asked of anything. So selfless she was. She would regularly stock up my freezer with goodies and was always available to babysit our children. But her generosity never came with any strings attached. It wasn't tit for tat by her. She was just an unconditional giver. She was a woman who avoided the limelight and had a small circle of close friends rather than a large circle of acquaintances. And yet, her simplicity was amazing. My mother-in-law possessed true bina, true understanding. Although she preferred to remain in the background, I know that my father-in-law would often consult with her when it came to understanding certain issues or getting her help with complicated problems that people put on his desk. Externals didn't matter much to my in-laws. They were still living in the same little house they purchased when their sons were toddlers, with its 50s style furniture and decor. They just simply didn't live for this world. They were so other world driven. The most important thing is that Tati should continue to learn without any pressure. My mother-in-law would always say the focus for them was Torah and Torah learning. That was an amazing home. It was a home of idealism. When my mother-in-law was first diagnosed with cancer, she was in her early 50s. In addition to still teaching school and being a full-time rebbitzin, helping my father-in-law with the congregation, she had recently joined the Chevra Kadisha, which is an amazing mitzvah. Those are the individuals that volunteer to help prepare the dead and make sure that the dead are properly buried. But now she began spending her days at Memorial Sloan Kettering undergoing chemotherapy and recuperating from its horrible effects. At first, the doctors were hopeful, but eventually the chemo was unsuccessful and the radiation did more harm than good. My poor mother-in-law suffered for several years, her entire life revolving around her treatments until she lapsed into a coma from which she never woke up. After her passing, my father-in-law fell into a mild depression and lost his zest for life, what we call in Hebrew simchas chaim. He no longer had simchas chaim, he had no desire to live. My in-laws had had a beautiful marriage, and my mother-in-law always said that the pain of infertility had brought them even closer, making them even more bonded as husband and wife. My father-in-law never so much as cooked an egg or polished his own shoes. My mother-in-law took care of everything. My mother-in-law did everything for my father-in-law. As the only children who lived nearby, he now depended on me for everything from doing his laundry, cooking his meals, and keeping the house tidy, which is what I did gladly for my father-in-law. He steadfastly refused to move in with us, though claiming he didn't want to be a burden. My father-in-law was mourning, but he was still relatively young and in excellent health. So eventually the Shadchanim, the matchmakers, began to inundate him with suggestions. He was a widower, he was in demand, he was an excellent human being, he was a scholar in great health, and so naturally there was a nice market of widows and divorced women who could be wonderful possible second wives for him. Aside from enjoying the respect and admiration of the entire community, my father-in-law was also one of those rare widowers without a large family or single children to worry about, so he was a great catch. So it wasn't surprising that many shadchanim or matchmakers came knocking down his door. What was surprising was the day he called me up and said that he wanted to discuss something. It turned out that he wanted my help with finding a shidduch. He was uncomfortable doing research on the women on his own, so he asked me to help him sift through the names that were being suggested, and at this point he had a pile of dating resumes. It was an awkward moment, but I felt obligated to step up to the plate and be there for my father-in-law. Finding a shidduch from my father-in-law soon became a full-time job. It was emotionally exhausting. In as much as my husband understood that it was time for his father to remarry, I tried to do my best when he wasn't around. I spent hours on the phone explaining to all the matchmakers that my father-in-law needed an idealistic woman, because that's how my mother-in-law was. Someone who was similar to my mother-in-law, who was a simple woman, who was devoted to my father-in-law, who wasn't a person who asked for much in terms of materialism, and that's the kind of person that I felt my father-in-law needed. Many of the widows and divorcees being suggested were much more sophisticated and worldly than my mother-in-law was. As a long-time shadchan explained, it's simply the law of supply and demand. Let's face it. There aren't that many women who are like your mother-in-law. She was one of a kind in terms of her idealism, in terms of her separation and detachment from this world. And if they were, they often had other issues that made the shidduch impractical. The same names kept coming up again and again, and I began to despair if we could ever find a potential soulmate for my father-in-law. Then just several days shy of my mother-in-law's second yortzeit, my father-in-law told me that someone had called him with a suggestion that sounded promising. Brenda Steinberg had lost her husband, a renowned philanthropist, 4 years ago, and was willing to move to New York from Europe for the right husband, for the right catch, for the right soulmate. I took down all the information and assured him that I would get to work on it right away. But after making only a few calls, I realized that it would never work. Brenda's husband had been a fabulously wealthy man, a multi-millionaire, who made his fortune in real estate and contributed generously to many yeshivas throughout the globe. Brenda and her husband had raised the 4 children in a lap of luxury, enjoying frequent vacations worldwide, spending time in their penthouse in Jerusalem, their condo in Miami Beach, and their cottage in the Swiss Alps. This was a well-heeled couple. And so I asked myself, could this actually match for my father-in-law? Brenda was an aristocratic woman who had never washed a floor or paid a bill in her life. Everything was done for her by servants. Just the thought of her marrying my father-in-law, a rabbi who spent his days and nights learning Torah and shunning luxuries, was totally ridiculous. Yet the shadchan was persistent, assuring him that Brenda truly wanted to marry a person who was a Torah scholar. Money would be no object, of course. My father-in-law could continue learning undisturbed and would even be able to publish the book he had written years ago but put aside for lack of funds. I think you should tell the shadchan that it's a nice idea, but it's not for you, I said respectfully to my father-in-law. As far as I can tell, you have almost nothing in common with this woman. It's hard enough to build a second marriage where you share similar values, let alone when you come from such different backgrounds. My father-in-law listened carefully, but was non-committal. To my surprise, while he was always accepted my judgment before, he allowed the shadchan to convince him to meet Brenda. The next thing we knew, Brenda had flown to New York to meet him. I was horrified. It was my father-in-law marrying her. He was headed for a disaster. Don't worry, my husband reassured me. My father realized on his own that this shidduch is not for him. Famous last words. Their first meeting went very well, and soon followed by another, and another, and another. After they met a third time, I could tell that my father-in-law was ready to go ahead. Still, he hesitated, asking me again to express my concerns. What do you think? He asked me, Judy. Is she for me or not for me? She may be a wonderful person, I said to my father-in-law, but she's not for you. I was under the impression that you wanted a wife like mommy, someone who values Torah and doesn't need much to make her happy. Brenda is everything that mommy was not. I don't see the connection. I explained to him that they had no shaykhs to materialistic women who were used to being showered with jewelry. Unlike mommy, Brenda was a woman of the world who wouldn't be content sitting at home, and he would have to travel with her because she was a worldwide traveler. He would also probably need to get used to live-in help, which would no doubt make him uncomfortable. He was just not used to that lifestyle. But she's such a good person, Tati argued. All she wants is to help me grow in Torah. He sounded like a young, idealistic young man going out for the first time rather than a 65-year-old widower. Still, my opinion did mean something, and my father-in-law postponed making a decision. When the shadchan learned that I was the one who had put a damper on the shidduch, he called to pressure me to back off. You think you know your father-in-law, but you only know him from one perspective, he said. If he wants to marry someone who's financially comfortable and will support him, why do you have to interfere and get involved? This argument went round and around as Brenda continued to wait impatiently for him to make up his mind. Eventually, David and I made the decision to bow out, and we told our father-in-law that if he truly felt that she was right for him, who are we to say otherwise? 2 days later, my father-in-law and Brenda were engaged. L'chaim. The occasion was bittersweet, yet still very much a simcha. My father-in-law asked that we come to the vort, which was held in an upscale hotel, to meet Brenda in person. I'd heard that Brenda was gracious and polite and was thus unprepared for the cool and very frosty reception that we received. Brenda was dressed in designer clothing, bedecked with expensive jewelry. Her shaitel was sleek. Her makeup was flawless. She was surrounded by her friends, the movers and shakers in our community, the wives of the renowned people who gave the most charity, whose names graced the pages of the local newspapers. My father-in-law was beaming as he embraced his son David and steered us towards his kala, his new bride-to-be. Brenda, this is David and my daughter-in-law Judy, the best children a father could have. Pleased to meet you, said Brenda stiffly, her body language expressing the opposite of her words. I reached out to give her a hug, but she shied away, quickly disappearing into the crowd and accepting yet another phony mazel tov. Unfortunately, this was only a taste of what was to come. I had learned through her grapevine that Brenda had heard that I was opposed to the shidduch, and she held it against me. My father-in-law traveled to Europe for the wedding and remained there for several weeks. When they returned, they moved into a new house that Brenda had purchased and decorated from start to finish. I heard it was magnificent, a palatial estate, but 2 months later, we were still not yet invited over. Brenda's children, 2 of whom lived in New York, were frequent Shabbos guests, but David and I were still not invited guests there. For David, his father's remarriage was traumatic. I feel like I've lost both parents, he confessed to me. My father-in-law expressed his yearning to see us, but cautioned that Brenda still needed more time. He wasn't ready to be able to open up his home to invite them. She's finding it overwhelming, he said to us, having to get used to a new community and lifestyle. I want to give her some space before I get you guys invited over. Shortly thereafter, the new couple went on an extended honeymoon to several countries, culminating in a week in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. David stood in for his father at the shul, serving as interim rabbi. But his father had yet to return to regular learning, which only confirmed what I suspected. His new wife was completely out of his league. My father-in-law had been married for 6 months when Brenda hosted a Chanukah Sabayis party. That's a party that we create when we induct a new house, when we move into a new house. So it's there's a ceremony which is called the Chanukah Sabayis, in which we dedicate the new home. We invite people, we make a special seudah or festive meal. Rabbis come and give speeches, to which we were reluctantly invited. I felt like an interloper as I stepped into my father-in-law's new home, or Brenda's new home, however. My father-in-law welcomed us warmly, but Brenda barely tolerated our presence. Still, we pretended that we didn't notice, and we complimented her on what great and gorgeous decorating skills she had, and how nice her children were. Bobby doesn't really like us, my 9-year-old commented on the way home, which is the new grandma. She didn't even look at us or offer us anything to eat. Because it's a second marriage, my teenage daughter said. Second marriages are very complicated, as she spoke out to her younger brother. They don't need to be, David said later. Not all second marriages are fraught with problems. She's probably still upset because you oppose the shidduch, said my wise husband. It makes her feel insecure. Let's just give it some time. I gave it plenty of time, 2 full years, and Brenda was still not talking to me. Although we spoke often, to my surprise, my father-in-law was content, adjusting to his new jet-setting lifestyle. I called Brenda on Erev Shabbos to wish her a good Shabbos, and despite her stiffness, she still seemed to appreciate it. Still, she barely thawed and was definitely friendlier to my sister-in-law in Montreal than to me. I knew that Brenda was regularly hosting her married children that came over to the house, but she had never asked us over. Knowing this was very offensive and hurtful. A few months later, Brenda and my father-in-law had just returned from yet another extended vacation, and my father-in-law was feeling a bit under the weather. He woke up in the middle of the night gasping for breath, with pain radiating from his left shoulder down up to his jaw. Brenda called Hatzalah, and he was rushed to the hospital. My father-in-law had suffered a massive heart attack and was in critical condition. My father-in-law hovered between life and death for several weeks. Throughout the time, Brenda remained at his side, caring for him around the clock. We were awed by her dedication. Brenda had lived her entire life in the lap of luxury. Now she was spending night after night sleeping on a hospital chair and developing a crick in her neck, refusing to leave her husband alone even for a minute. We offered to take shifts, but Brenda would not hear of it. Brenda called us every day with a detailed update. When my father-in-law was finally moved to a rehab facility, Brenda spent hours encouraging him through the grueling therapy as he learned to regain the use of his left side. Whenever we came to visit, we expressed our gratitude to Brenda for her self-sacrifice and the way she was taking care of my father-in-law. I don't think Tati would be here if not for you, Brenda, I said through my tears. To my surprise, Brenda gave me a spontaneous hug, erasing 2 years of a Cold War with one gesture. Over the next few months, my relationship with Brenda, the woman who had snubbed me and made it clear I was unwelcome in her life, did a 180-degree change. Once I sensed Brenda's true value and saw how devotedly she took care of my father-in-law, my perception of her totally changed. Since we had never quarreled or exchanged nasty words, there was no history of negativity for us to erase, just fertile ground on which to build a relationship, which is a key point that I want to make here. Sometimes we fall to someone's image assuming that they're a certain type of person. We don't get to know them, and then we just put them into a certain stereotype. Oh, because they have money, they're probably not friendly. Or because they jet set, they may not be too nice. But you never know. You have to get to know the human being. I began to realize that the more we showed Brenda our appreciation, the more comfortable she felt in our presence. And the more she opened up. So all it takes, ladies and gentlemen, is this basic communication to get the word out there to the other person, to show them you admire them, you like them, that you enjoy their company. Although Brenda was as different from David's mother as night and day, despite her extravagant lifestyle, she was a woman of fine character. I just never knew it because I never made the effort to get to know her. In retrospect, it wasn't Brenda who had rejected me. It was I who had rejected her. And she had merely reacted to it. She knew that I disapproved of her, and perhaps I had unconsciously projected my feelings in her presence. I believed that this is what happened because once I looked past the external trappings and started letting her know who I was and get to know her, and how lucky my father-in-law was to have her as a wife, Brenda responded with kindness and warmth. Today my father-in-law has made a complete recovery and is enjoying his golden years with his wonderful wife. We have a warm and close relationship, and we spend many Shabbosim and all Ayom Tovim with them. It took a medical crisis in our validation of Brenda to thaw the ice. Our wholehearted admiration made her feel secure and cherished and has enabled her to be a true Bobby to our children these days. So ladies and gentlemen, before we make conclusions about people without getting to know them, take the time to get to know them, to introduce yourself into their life, to warm up to them, and they'll warm up back to you because what you put out is what you'll get back. So that's critical, and that's a lesson that we need to learn.